Jon Snow stood on the windswept battlements, the sky overhead streaked with cold iron clouds that threatened snow, as if the north itself sensed the upheaval in its midst. The worn stones beneath his boots had borne the weight of countless Stark lords, kings in the north, and their loyal bannermen. He remembered his first steps here as a boy, trailing after his father, Eddard Stark. He remembered practicing swordplay in the courtyard, sneaking around corridors with Arya, the hush of the library where Sansa once learned her heraldry. The ghost of every memory confronted him now, silent witnesses to his choice. He closed his eyes. The wind cut at his cheeks, and in that moment he wished he could be anywhere else. But there was nowhere else to be. Not anymore. He had made the decision with the same grim, quiet resolve his father might have shown at an execution. Yet the difference was as wide as the wall once stood tall. His father never would have done this. Therein lay the pain. His father, his mother, the siblings he loved, living and dead. Every single Stark had shaped who Jon was, but the name they had given him turned into a curse. Son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. The rightful heir to a throne he did not want. The living symbol of rebellions and alliances that had left Westeros battered for decades. Even after everything, even after bending the knee to Daenerys, after the war against the dead, the final betrayal that left the Dragon Queen in ashes, he had remained tied to destinies he never asked for. He had believed himself free when he went north of the Wall, choosing the quiet companionship of Ghost and the free folk, letting the Seven Kingdoms tear themselves apart or rebuild under whomever might take up the mantle of leadership. But the old ghosts would not leave him alone. Whispers drifted on the wind. Men came and went, proclaiming him the only rightful king left, the only Targaryen Stark with a claim. Some came to kill him, some came to carry him south, and some came to worship him. He found no peace in that haunted land of snow. Tormund did his best to dissuade strangers and keep them away. Yet they came and they came, like crows to a fresh battlefield, sniffing out the seeds of a new war. When finally one band of Southerners took it upon themselves to ascend the Frost Fangs and corner him in a frozen valley, he realized the entire North would never know rest, or at least never let him rest, so long as Winterfell stood as a symbol of the Stark legacy, and, in turn, a symbol of his claim. Gone were the days when the scions of House Stark simply bowed out from the Games of Thrones. As long as people remembered the Stark name, so long as they associated that name with him, a Targaryen bastard who had become the White Wolf, the king in the north once, and king of the Seven Kingdoms in the eyes of some, he was doomed to be a pivot in new conflicts. It would never end. Not unless he ended it. Word reached him that Sansa Stark had perished in the south, from a fever that struck her court in the Vale. The raven bore a black wax seal and contained fewer details than he would have liked. Arya was lost to the winds of the west and had not been heard from in more than a year. Bran, if the rumors were to be believed, wandered the realm in strange new ways, bound to the weirwoods or some arcane knowledge. Jon felt an unspoken hollowness in his chest, imagining the old home they had all cherished slowly emptying of any living soul who loved it. He had expected to feel sorrow so deep it tore him in half. He felt that sorrow, yes, but lurking behind it was something else. A grim acceptance that if Winterfell remained the seat of the Stark name, it would simply feed the cycle of those who insisted on using that name to shape the realm. He rode south with a band of wildlings who understood neither his purpose nor his need, but who trusted him nonetheless. His face remained impassive, the cold years in the far north having chiseled his features into stone. When he crossed the old boundary of the Gift, the memories threatened to overwhelm him. Ghost loped at his side, silent, massive, his fur a patch of white gloom against the dark pine forests. At times, Jon thought he saw the red eyes of the direwolf stare at him questioningly, as if asking, "Why do we go back there? Why do you do this?" He had no answer, only that restless compulsion that demanded he cross the miles, climb the ridge lines, navigate broken roads, and once more face the gates of Winterfell. The castle still stood proud. Its walls loomed tall and ancient, older than living memory. Fires still burned in the great hall. A small retinue of loyalists, men and women who had served House Stark for generations, greeted Jon with surprise and awe when he approached the courtyard. They recognized him as if he were a specter come home to roost. Some said, "My lord," or "My king," or "Jon Stark," or "Jon Targaryen," uncertain which name or title was right. He answered them with only a polite dip of his head. He accepted no titles, no gestures of fealty. He spent the first night in his old bedchamber, haunted by how little it had changed and how everything in him had shifted so far beyond the boy who once dreamed here. The ache of memory sat on his chest, heavier than armor. In the courtyard at dawn, among the scattered straw and the battered training dummies, he took Longclaw in hand and drilled until sweat soaked his hair and cloak. Memories of Robb's laughter flitted by, echoes of Theon Greyjoy's uncertain stance, the sweet shriek of Arya as she darted around their father's practice yard. He struck until the dummy's stuffing burst. Wildlings watched from the edges, and a few Stark loyalists lowered their heads in sadness or confusion. No one dared approach him. His gaze was the gaze of a man beyond all hope or comfort. Later, he roamed the crypts alone. Down there in the dark, he passed by statue after statue of the Stark forefathers. At each, he knelt, not in reverence but in some forlorn attempt to say goodbye. His father's statue was unerringly lifelike, stoic and strong as the man himself. He could have sworn he heard his father's quiet voice. "The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword." Jon's lips twisted into something like a pained smile. He had once believed so fervently in those words. Yet now, standing in front of that grave, he understood them differently. Sometimes passing the sentence meant doing something inconceivably dark for a cause one believed was just. And sometimes that cause was so horrifying that the man passing the sentence would never stand upright under the weight of his own guilt. He walked the empty corridors and halls, corners where he and his siblings had hidden from septas or maesters. He saw the old library, the solar, the great hall. The last remnants of House Stark's staff, few in number, kept the place functioning, but it felt hollow without the presence of those who truly made it a home. Sansa was gone. Arya was who knows where. Bran was out of reach. Rickon had died long ago. Robb had been murdered at the Red Wedding. Their father, their mother, bones lost to war and parted from the living. Jon himself felt like an echo, the last living soul who carried the blood of House Stark in any meaningful sense, twisted with Targaryen inheritance and bound by prophecy and war to a future he never asked for. He spent many days walking the grounds and many nights wrestling with the weight of what he intended. He found himself lying awake, staring at the vaulted ceiling of the Lord's chamber, sometimes hearing the wail of wind through the cracks in the stones. Once, he almost convinced himself to ride back north at dawn, to live with the free folk and let Winterfell stand. But dawn came and found him on the ramparts, his eyes on the horizon. He felt that same stifling knowledge. As long as Winterfell and its name remained, men would either rally behind him or seek to destroy him, and they would cloak their agendas in the Stark name. He had to end it. He was not wholly alone. A small council of loyalists, men and women whose hearts were broken after Sansa's death, spoke to him in hushed tones. Some pleaded with him to stay, to take the title Warden of the North. Others asked him, quietly, to pass the seat to some cousin or distant relative of the House Stark line. When he refused, they pressed him to think about the future of the North. All this time, Jon listened politely, for these people had good hearts. But their pleas echoed in his ears like the endless howling of wind. He had heard it all before, the talk of duty, of preserving a name, of forging alliances. He had tried so much in his life to do what was right for others. And for all that, Winterfell had fallen into ruin before, had been occupied by Boltons, burned, captured, tortured. The same cycles repeated, spinning like the wheel Daenerys once spoke of breaking. She had believed conquering Westeros by fire and blood would break the wheel. Perhaps the wheel was not so easily broken. Perhaps it took an unimaginable act to shatter it once and for all. He declared, one afternoon, that he wished to speak with everyone still in residence at Winterfell, from the loyalists to the servants to the stable hands. He gathered them in the great hall beneath the banners that bore the direwolf sigil, the same banners that had once heralded Robb as the king in the north. They watched him with hopeful expressions, for many believed he would proclaim himself their lord. Instead, he told them that he wished to give them leave to depart, with supplies enough to reach White Harbor or the Barrowlands or wherever they might find new opportunities. They had a tendy to prepare. Some shouted protests, some wept, some demanded an explanation. He refused to give one. A single wildling at his side fixed the loyal Northerners with a stern glare, letting them know that should they test Jon Snow's word, they would pay dearly for it. But Jon did not threaten or cajole. He said only that it was time for them to go. If they did not depart willingly, he would force them out with as little harm as possible. A wave of shock and despair rippled through the hall, for many had served House Stark their entire lives, and generations before them had done the same. Yet, all the same, they could see the unyielding decision in Jon's eyes. There was no point in questioning him. He would not budge. Afterward, he shut himself away in his father's old solar. Ghost sat beside the hearth, silent as his namesake. A handful of wildlings, men who had joined Jon on this grim mission out of the mixture of loyalty and curiosity, filled their mugs with sour ale, saying little. Tormund was not there. He had parted ways with Jon before they crossed the gift, shaking his head. "I won't be part of this. I knew your father, or the man you believed was your father. Good man. I knew you too, boy. But this ain't what you want to become. I'll not watch you do it." Those were Tormund's final words before he and a handful of others turned their backs, heading north. Even now, as Jon sat in the flicker of candlelight, Tormund's words rang in his ears. But Tormund had never been forced to bear the weight of prophecy and inheritance. Jon's gloom would not relent. The day came when the last of the servants left Winterfell. Some left in tears, others in anger, and a few in confusion. None understood why he needed the castle emptied. No Stark in history had ever done such a thing. To them, it must have seemed an act of betrayal. But Jon endured their looks and their pleas. Let them call him kinslayer of a sort, to tear down the memory of his own house. He had grown used to the taste of condemnation. No one else remained now, save a dozen or so wildlings who had sworn themselves to his side, though it was unclear if they truly approved of what he intended or simply followed his lead because they trusted him. One evening, just before the fateful act, a fierce woman named Vali, tall, broad-shouldered, with scars across her face from direwolf fights, spoke up around the low fire in the great hall. She said, "Snow, we have fought by you, eaten by your side, bled with you, but even I cannot see the sense in this. This fortress can serve your people, these men and women of the north. Why destroy it?" Others watched carefully, wanting to hear how Jon would defend his decision. He sighed, staring into the fire. Winterfell is not just stone. It's a symbol. For better or worse, it's a symbol that will draw men and women to claim it, to claim me through it. Wars will break out, and those I love, those who remain, will find themselves dragged into one conflict after another. I once thought I could leave it behind, but the world will not let me. This is the only way to sever the ties once and for all. House Stark must end, and Winterfell must end with it. She spat into the fire. Sounds like Targaryen madness to me. He did not deny it. In truth, a part of him wondered if indeed he was falling prey to the same madness that whispered in the Targaryen line, from the Mad King to Daenerys in her final days of rage. Yet if madness was what it took to save the North from unending conflict, perhaps it was a madness forced upon him by the realm itself. He said no more that night. The next morning, the sky was a steel-gray dome, thick with clouds threatening a heavy snowfall. Jon gathered the wildlings at the base of the walls, inside the courtyard. Barrels of oil, kindling, and pitch lined the corridors. The same old winter stores that had once fed House Stark now served a darker purpose. Fuel for a conflagration. He could smell the tang of the pitch in the cold air. The ravens had gone, or perhaps perched somewhere out of sight, as if they sensed the coming destruction. Only Ghost remained at his side, tail twitching, his red eyes flicking between Jon and the gate. Jon walked to the base of the first keep, the oldest part of the castle, with walls that had stood since the days of Brandon the Builder, or so the legends claimed. He let his gloved hand trail across the rough-hewn stones. Ancient, magnificent, full of history that shaped the entire North. He closed his eyes and found a tremor in his chest. Every lesson he had learned from his father, from the old gods, from the vow of the Night's Watch, warred inside him. But none of those oaths or lessons had saved the realm from bloodshed. His own life had been spared by the Lord of Light for reasons he could not comprehend. All that was left was the duty he had assigned himself. He lifted a torch, stared into its flame. "Begin," he said, a raw note in his voice. Without ceremony, the wildlings lit the trails of pitch. Fire licked along the castle's base, quickly feeding on the oil-drenched timbers stacked against the walls. Thick, acrid smoke billowed into the winter air. Soon, the courtyard was ablaze with columns of flame. The fire crackled and snapped, racing up the wood scaffolding, clinging to the old stone, spreading faster than one might think possible in the frigid climate. The gates, the stables, the great keep, all were ringed with kindling. The heat pressed against Jon's face like an open furnace. He could feel the sweat on his brow despite the cold wind. He stepped back, watching as the flames rose higher. Black smoke curled upward, swirling into the gray sky, blotting out the sun. The courtyard, once a place of childhood laughter and the clang of steel in training, now looked like the mouth of some fiery hell. Bits of ash swirled in the air. Stone popped and cracked under the intense heat. Wooden beams groaned, caved in, collapsed. Soon, the ancient halls that once housed the hopes and tragedies of House Stark were consumed. Jon stood there, transfixed, as if part of him expected an echo of the old gods to thunder from the heart of the weirwood in the godswood, cursing him for his sacrilege. But the godswood was ablaze as well, the leaves of the weirwood tree withering under the licking tongues of fire, bark charring from pure white to black. He had told himself that if the old gods were real, they had allowed too many horrors to happen here. There would be no saving this place now. The roar of the inferno drowned out all other sound. He could no longer hear his own heartbeat. The thick smoke stung his eyes, forced him to blink tears away. He coughed, covering his mouth with a cloak sleeve. The wildlings retreated, some cursing, some looking around in fear, as if expecting ghosts and wraiths to rise from the crypts. Yet Jon did not move. He watched the flames devour centuries of history. Perhaps in that blaze, he saw the illusions of glory burn away, everything that had weighed upon him from the moment he first learned the truth of his parentage. When a tower collapsed, sending a shower of sparks into the air, he felt a strange mixture of triumph and despair. Winterfell was falling. He had chosen this. There was no turning back. The ancestral seat of the Starks, the castle that had stood for thousands of years, was being undone by his own hand. He had ended the line, or so he told himself. He would remain Jon Snow or Aegon Targaryen, whatever name was left to him, bereft of any illusions about being a Stark. Let the realm see the final testament. Winterfell was gone. They could not raise a new war in the name of House Stark if House Stark no longer existed. Yet as he stared into the conflagration, a deep hollowness grew within him. Every memory he'd ever cherished was incinerated before his eyes. The time Bran had climbed the walls, the time Ned ruffled his hair in approval, the time Catelyn avoided his gaze in the corridors, the ghost of Arya practicing with her small sword, the crisp winter mornings, the hush of fresh snowfall, the giant heart tree's red leaves reflecting in the water of the godswood. It was all gone. Every stone that had borne witness to the joys and sorrows of his childhood was now nothing but ruin, soot, and flame. Some of the wildlings coughed violently, wanting to leave the courtyard. The heat was too intense. But Jon remained for another long moment, letting the tears that stung his eyes have their way. The tears belonged to the boy who had once loved this place beyond measure. The man who stood there now was cold, resigned, and empty. He turned his back at last, walking away from the raging inferno, with Ghost padding at his heels. Outside the walls, the snow had begun to fall. The flakes were large and heavy, smothering embers that drifted past the crumbling ramparts. Felt like the North wept. In the days that followed, The great fire could be seen from miles away. Refugees on the road, some who had left Winterfell at Jon's command, looked over their shoulders in horror. They had not expected him to go so far. Rumors spread quickly. Jon Snow burned Winterfell. Jon Snow destroyed the Stark home. Some said it was proof he was a Targaryen, that the dragon's madness ran in his veins. Others speculated it was vengeance for a life of being named a bastard. A few whispered that he must have had some hidden reason, perhaps to purge the darkness that had plagued House Stark. The truth, known only to Jon, did not matter to anyone else. The realm had its stories now. Jon and his small band of wildlings camped a league away, high on a rocky outcrop, where they could watch the destruction from a distance. Black smoke drifted into the sky for days. Flames smoldered in the rubble. Cinders glowed in the night like hateful eyes. The silent question in the eyes of his companions was the same. What now? As the final towers crumbled and the gates caved in, leaving only scorched remains of stone, Jon quietly ordered the group to ride north. They did not protest. He spoke to no one about his feelings, and none had the courage to press him. They navigated the roads once more, passing travelers who gawked at them with fear and disbelief. Jon kept his hood low, his gaze on the trail. Ghost moved at his side, a silent sentinel. A few times, someone recognized him, called out, "Why, Jon Snow? Why?" He did not answer. He had no answer that would satisfy them. How could they understand? They reached the last hearth, where the new House Umber tried to gather farmers and hold the region together. Even there, word had spread of Winterfell's ruin. Lord Umber, a stout young man with a missing ear from some battle or another, looked pale and troubled when he greeted Jon. "My lord, is it true? Is Winterfell really destroyed?" Jon only nodded, throat tight. The shock on the young lord's face was answer enough. The man bowed his head, not in respect but in despair. "The North has no seat now. What shall become of us? Even if the South remains quiet, our people look to Winterfell for guidance." Jon answered with a tired voice. "Lead them yourself. Protect your own. Look to your neighbors. The North does not need a single seat. It never did." The young lord frowned. "But the bannermen—" "I release you from any oath to House Stark," Jon said. "Do what is right for your people." And with that, he rode away. The numbness in his chest only deepened. He recalled Sansa's vow to protect the North, to keep it strong. How disappointed she would be if she saw him now, having torn down the very symbol of their childhood and their lineage. But Sansa was gone to the grave, her dreams buried with her. Arya had vanished. Bran was something else entirely. The North was left with petty lords to manage their small patches of land. Perhaps that was for the best. The grand illusions had only led them to heartbreak. Jon traveled with his companions through the biting cold, the wind whipping across the plains and hills. Each mile felt heavier. He had done the unthinkable, and now there was no script for what came next. He passed the ruin of the wall. The gap the Night King had made with Viserion's fire was still there. Castles along the wall were desolate. The new Night's Watch, if it still existed, was a fraction of its old strength, and those stationed there had little will to patrol. The threat of the others was gone, the White Walkers defeated, and so the realm neglected its ancient defenses once again. Eventually, Jon led the wildlings beyond the wall, back into the expanse of white that he had once believed might be his final sanctuary. The devastation behind him weighed on every footstep. At night, he dreamed of flames devouring the face of Ned Stark's statue, of Sansa's voice screaming in the smoke, of Arya's blade pressed to his heart in betrayal. He would wake in a cold sweat, breath steaming in the freezing air of their makeshift shelters. Sometimes Ghost would press close, licking his face with a concerned whine. Jon found no solace in the direwolf's warmth. The deed was done. A stain like that could not be washed away. As the days wore on, the small group of wildlings started to fracture. Some no longer cared to follow a man who would burn his own ancestral home. Others had families to think of, wanting to settle in safer valleys or join Tormund's people. Slowly, quietly, they departed. One by one or in pairs, they vanished into the wilderness. Jon did not stop them. He told himself it was better this way. Eventually, only a single figure remained besides Ghost. Vali, the fierce woman who had questioned him, seemed to linger. One evening, as they camped at the foot of a cliff, she finally approached him. "We going to keep wandering until the snows bury us?" she asked with a bluntness that reminded Jon of Ygritte, once upon a time. He did not look up from the small fire he was coaxing to life. "Go where you will. You're free." She folded her arms, ignoring the harsh wind that ruffled her furs. "I could, but I want to know what you plan to do, Snow. Destroyed your castle, your house, your name, at least that's how I see it. What's left for you? You're like a ghost now, same as that white wolf you keep at your side." Jon stared into the flame, his face set like stone. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I thought destroying Winterfell would free me from the burdens of the realm. But I feel heavier now than ever. Perhaps the realm is free of House Stark, but I'm not free. I'm still living, and living means carrying the weight of what I've done." She snorted. No running from that, is there?" He said nothing. The night deepened, the sky radiant with pale stars shining in the blackness. The wind hissed around the rocks. At length, Vali shrugged and turned away. "No sense in me traveling with a man who doesn't know where he's going. You saved my life once, back when we fought the dead. I won't forget that, but I can't do this. You're too deep in your gloom. There's no place for me in that." She hefted her pack and her axe. "If we meet again, maybe you'll have found some reason to keep going besides regret. Until then, farewell, Jon Snow." He gave her a curt nod, saying nothing. She melted into the darkness as if swallowed by it. Ghost looked after her, ears pricked, then turned back to Jon. Alone once more, Jon fed the fire a few twigs, absent-mindedly petting Ghost's flank. The wolf's fur was thick, providing a measure of comfort in the frozen silence. Jon's mind wandered to the last time he had felt anything like hope. Perhaps it was during the final victory over the White Walkers, or maybe earlier, when the Starks reunited at Winterfell. How fleeting it had all been. Sleep found him eventually, though it brought no peace. He dreamed he walked the ruins of Winterfell, but the flames were gone. Snow draped the blackened stones. In his dream, the ground was littered with bones and direwolf sigils. He heard Sansa's voice crying out from the crypts. He tried to run to her, but the corridors kept shifting. Then Arya appeared, wearing a face he did not recognize, her dagger pointed at him. "You destroyed us," she whispered, eyes hollow. When he tried to speak, no words came, only a flood of blood that poured from his mouth. He woke gasping, the taste of ashes on his tongue. The following day, he broke camp, heading deeper into the wilderness. He no longer knew if he sought life or death. The wind battered him, the chill sank into his bones. Once, he had known survival out here alongside the free folk. But his heart was no longer that of a survivor. He often found himself stepping dangerously close to ravines, eyes lingering on the drop below. But the memory of the times he had died already, stabbed by his own men at Castle Black, did nothing to give him courage. Perhaps he wanted to see if death would claim him again. But if some strange gods kept resurrecting him to do their will, he suspected they might not let him die so easily. He pressed on, a walking husk of a man, with the White Wolf as his only companion. Days turned to weeks. He lost count of time. The north beyond the wall could devour men who had no sense of direction or purpose. He hunted small game, using a bow he had fashioned from wood and sinew. Sometimes he found half-buried huts left by other free folk. He would shelter there for a night, waiting out storms. He rarely encountered other people, and when he did, they often kept their distance, uncertain of him. The name Jon Snow held no sway here, or if it did, it was the story of a hero who once fought the dead. But the man they saw before them was gaunt, haunted, his hair grown long and tangled, his beard thick, a tall figure in battered black leathers. They had no reason to bother him. He lived thus, day by day, for a stretch of lonely months. He scavenged, hunted, mended his clothes, spoke to Ghost in quiet tones. He found no peace, only a kind of numb acceptance that this was to be his existence until one day nature or the gods saw fit to claim him. Each night, the memory of Winterfell's flames tormented him. The sense of finality weighed like a millstone around his neck. Sometimes he asked the old gods, or any gods who might hear, why he had been spared from death if all he was meant to do was commit that monstrous act. The wind never answered. Then came a day in the fleeting autumn of the far north, when the sky was still bright with that pale, fading sunlight, that he spotted a figure in the distance. A single rider moving across the tundra with purpose. Ghosts stiffened, hackles raised. Jon found a vantage point on a rocky rise, peering through the swirling snow. The rider was dressed in dark furs, riding a hardy Garen. Slowly, carefully, Jon made his way down to intercept. He had no reason to approach strangers, but something about the rider's posture tugged at him. Familiar. Could it be Tormund? Or Vali, returning? Or a messenger from the Watch? He forced aside the swirl of questions, focusing on the immediate moment. When he drew close, Ghost at his side, the rider halted, raising a gloved hand. Jon stopped several yards away. A moment later, the rider removed the hood, revealing a face Jon recognized instantly. Arya. His heart jolted so hard he almost reeled. She swung down from the saddle with the grace of a practiced traveler. Her hair was cropped shorter than when he last saw her, but her eyes were the same, gray and piercing, laced with a hardness formed by years on the road. She wore practical leathers. Her belt hung with a slender sword and several daggers. She took a slow step forward, staring at him, taking in his wild hair, his unkempt beard, the hollows under his cheeks. Ghost let out a low, uncertain whine. "Jon," she said, voice low, the single syllable carrying both relief and accusation. He couldn't speak. Emotion swarmed him. Guilt, sorrow, longing, shame. He swallowed, tried to form words. Nothing would come. Arya took another step. "I heard what you did," she said. Her tone was not condemning nor sympathetic, just factual, as if stating an unfortunate truth. "I had to find you." He forced a breath. I didn't think you'd ever come back to Westeros," he managed, voice cracking with disuse. It felt wrong to speak to her without 1,000 apologies on his lips. A flicker of something crossed her face. Pain, maybe. "I was west of Westeros for a time, until word reached me that Sansa died. I returned too late. Everything was gone." She paused, swallowing. "And then I heard about Winterfell." Jon's eyes dropped to the snow at his feet. He expected her to draw a dagger, to bury it in his chest, a swift retribution for the ruin he had caused. Some part of him almost welcomed that outcome, but she did not move. They stood there amid the swirling snow, the hush of the north pressing in. At length he spoke. I was tired, Arya, of being a symbol, of other people's wars. I thought destroying the seat of House Stark would end it." She exhaled, the cloud of her breath drifting away. "I understand symbols," she said, her voice subdued. "I walked away from them myself after the war. I never wanted to be lady of anything. But you," she shook her head. "Did you think about me? About Bran? Even if you wanted to run away from that name, Stark, it wasn't just yours to destroy." The accusation stung like a blade. Jon bowed his head. "I know," he whispered, "but I did it anyway." For a time, neither spoke. The wind sighed over the tundra, carrying faint echoes of ice shifting on distant glaciers. Arya's expression held pain, anger, and maybe a thread of pity. "Where do we go from here?" she asked at last. Jon closed his eyes. "I don't know." Silence settled again. He realized, in that moment, that the only apology that might matter could never undo the devastation he had wrought. Winterfell was gone forever, reduced to black rubble. The old god's grove was ashes. The crypts, the library, the halls that had once warmed them on long winter nights, the seat of House Stark's entire legacy, obliterated. Arya nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a new reality. "I won't kill you, Jon, but I won't pretend to forgive you either." Not yet. We Starks endured so much, and you—" She bit her lip. "I need to understand. But not here, freezing to death in the snow." Jon nodded in agreement, though he didn't truly care if he froze. But for Arya's sake, he roused himself. "There's a sheltered ravine a few hours' ride from here," he said. "We can camp there." She mounted her horse, not offering him a hand but not turning away, either. He trudged alongside Ghost, the gloom in his chest a constant companion. The entire way, he felt her gaze occasionally flick over him, as if trying to piece together the man he had become. He wondered if she saw the brother she once loved, or a stranger who had betrayed everything they once stood for. That night, after they set camp in the ravine, they sat across a small fire from each other. Arya broke the silence first, telling him of her travels west of Westeros, the uncharted isles she found, the perils at sea. She spoke with a kind of tired wonder, like someone who had glimpsed marvels but carried burdens that overshadowed them. Jon listened quietly, occasionally nodding, but he contributed few words about his time in the north. Eventually, her tale circled back to Westeros, the news of Sansa's last days ruling the Vale. He learned that Sansa had done much good for those under her protection, forging alliances and rebuilding the region after the wars. Hearing that made Jon's heart clench with guilt. She had carried the Stark name with pride until the end, and he had burned it all in the wake of her death. Arya's voice lowered as she came to the moment she learned of Sansa's passing. "I docked in Bravos, and a Bravosi banker told me. Said the Vale had lost its lady to a fever. They said she died nobly, helping the people of the mountains through a hard winter. She had no heirs." Arya paused, pressing her lips together. "I hurried back, hoping to salvage something of her legacy, only to find out you'd destroyed Winterfell. I traveled there, saw the ruin with my own eyes, saw the ashes of our father's bones in the crypt. I couldn't believe it was you, but everyone said it was." Jon watched the firelight dance on Arya's face. He felt tears burn his eyes, but he held them back. "It was me," he said hoarsely. "I ordered it, set the fires myself." "Why?" she asked, her tone laden with a quiet desperation. "Explain it to me. Help me make sense of it, because I can't." He took a shuddering breath, running his hand over his beard. "I felt cornered, Arya. After everything, people still wanted to make me a king, or kill me to prevent me from being one. I hated the game. I wanted to stop it before it began again. No more wars in our name. No more banners raised for House Stark. Sansa gone, Bran lost in his visions, you vanished to the ends of the world. I told myself House Stark was finished, and if the seat remained, it would only be used to ignite new conflicts. So I ended it." Arya listened, her gaze steady, though grief flickered in her eyes. "You destroyed the home of our ancestors, Ned Stark's seat, Catelyn's love for her children, every memory we had. You burned it down because you were afraid of what others would do." He couldn't meet her gaze. "Yes, I was afraid. Tired too. Tired of being used, of being told who I had to be." "I'm sorry, Arya." Silence stretched between them, the fire popping as it devoured the last bits of dry wood. Arya rubbed her hands together. She glanced at Ghost, who lay curled at Jon's side, ears alert but head resting on his paws. "I want to hate you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Part of me does. But you're still my brother, even if we don't share the same father. Or if you never believed you had the right to call yourself Ned Stark's son. We shared a childhood, illusions of safety, illusions of family. That's not gone." Jon let out a breath, thick with sorrow. "I wish it were that simple. I can't fix what I've done." "No," Arya said firmly. "You can't, and you'll live with it every day. That's the punishment. But running away to die in the snow, Sansa wouldn't want that. Robb wouldn't want that. Our father wouldn't want that. For all he might despise what you did. We Starks were always about duty, honor, family. Remember? If you burned our seat, maybe you can atone by protecting our people in some other way." He shook his head in anguish. "How? There is no House Stark left. Let the Northern Lords fend for themselves. I don't want to be anyone's leader." Arya gave a wry smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You never did. That never stopped the realm from looking to you." She looked away, as though searching the shadows for an answer. "You think the name Stark ends with the castle? That name can't be burned so easily. It's in the hearts of the North, in the stories told. You might have destroyed the seat, Jon, but the legacy lives on as long as you and I breathe. Maybe you wanted to break the wheel, but the wheel is bigger than a castle." He said nothing, only felt the weight of her words pressing on him. Could it be that his act of obliteration had accomplished nothing but heartbreak? He had told himself the realm would be free of House Stark's burdens. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps he only scattered those burdens to the four winds, sowing confusion and sorrow throughout the North. They spent the night by the fire, each wrestling with unspoken thoughts. Jon hardly slept. Every time he drifted off, images of Winterfell's flames and Arya's accusations jolted him awake. By morning, both of them looked exhausted. Arya prepared her horse, while Jon gathered his meager supplies. The question of what next loomed, massive and unspoken. As they rode together through the bleak northern expanse, they spoke little. Ghost padded alongside, weaving in and out of snowdrifts. Arya led the way at times, using her keen sense of direction to find passable terrain. Jon followed, occasionally scanning the horizon for movement. He found himself wondering if they might fall back into old camaraderie, if time and shared survival could mend the rift that his actions had created. But he knew better than to hope so easily. On the third day of travel, they came upon a small settlement of free folk, possibly allied with Tormund. The people there were wary, but recognized Arya from rumors. They said she looked like the wolf girl, the one who saved them in the long night. They welcomed them by a fire, offering a stew of roots and salted meat. Arya bowed her head in thanks. Jon hovered at the edges, silent, uneasy. He was no stranger to the free folk, but these days he felt like a wraith, unwelcome and unsettled wherever he went. Around the communal fire, some of the free folk asked questions. One older woman, her hair white as snow, asked, "Is it true, Snow? Did you burn the castle that was your home?" Her tone was curious rather than accusatory, as if trying to piece together a legend. Jon simply nodded, shame flooding him anew. The old woman clicked her tongue. "Strange to burn one's own home. I seen men burn villages of their enemies, but not their own hearth." A younger man with braided hair shrugged. "He's half a dragon, that one. Dragons burn. Always have." Arya bristled. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, though she didn't fully defend Jon's choice. The conversation simmered, stoked by rumor and speculation. Jon found himself withdrawing further, wishing he could vanish into the night. Ghost sensed his agitation, pressing close. Later, when they settled for sleep, Arya came to sit by him. Her expression was guarded. "I can't defend you," she said softly. "I can't explain why you did what you did in a way that makes sense to these people. It hardly makes sense to me." He bowed his head. "I understand." She stared into the darkness beyond the settlement's perimeter. "I want to see Bran," she said, almost as if to herself. "If anyone can make sense of this, he can. Maybe he saw it coming. Maybe he knows what's next." Jon felt a pang at the mention of Bran, the three-eyed raven. Bran seemed so far removed from the living world these days, from the joys and sorrows of mortal men. He wondered if Bran would judge him or remain coldly impartial. "Do you know where he is?" Jon asked. Arya shook her head. "No. Rumors say he wanders, sometimes in the Riverlands, sometimes beyond the Neck. As if he's not bound to one place. But I'll find him. I have to." Jon nodded, uncertain if he should join her quest or slip away. Part of him wanted to fade back into the wilderness, to let Arya carry whatever future remained. But another part, small and desperate, wanted to see if his sins could be understood or forgiven by the strange brother who saw the threads of time. "I'll go with you," he found himself saying. She looked at him sharply. For a moment, she seemed ready to argue, perhaps to tell him he'd only bring more ruin. But something in her gaze softened just a fraction. "Very well," she said. "But if you try to sabotage this, or if you do something insane again—" "I won't," he murmured. They left the free folk settlement at first light, heading south, ironically retracing the route Jon had taken when he'd come north after burning Winterfell. The journey proved long and arduous, and as the days turned into weeks, Arya and Jon spoke sparingly. Occasionally, Arya would share small recollections of their youth, moments that had nothing to do with the grand tragedies. She would recall a day they built a snow castle in the courtyard, or the time she accidentally shot an arrow onto the Great Hall's roof, and Jon helped her retrieve it. He listened, a pang tightening his chest with every memory. He realized that while the stones of Winterfell were gone, these recollections lived on within them. He had burned the physical shell, but their shared childhood remained in their minds. The guilt of that paradox weighed on him, but also gave him a strange sense of relief, some small spark of hope that not all was lost. As they traveled, word of Winterfell's destruction seemed to have spread throughout the north, carried on the tongues of merchants and travelers. Some villages barred their doors to Jon, calling him a kinslayer of sorts. Others spat at his feet. Only Arya's presence, and her formidable reputation, ensured they weren't outright attacked. She was the Night Wolf, some said, the girl who slew the Night King's captains with a blade of Valyrian steel. Rumors grew with each retelling, painting her as a wraith who could wear the faces of the dead. Jon almost smiled at the exaggerations, though he knew some of them were closer to truth than rumor. They crossed the White Knife near a destroyed bridge that had not been rebuilt since the wars. Makeshift rafts got them across. Along the way, they heard talk that the Manderleys of White Harbor had begun to lay claim to the mantle of guardianship for the north, arguing that with Winterfell gone and the Starks scattered, someone had to lead. Other northern houses remained divided. Some called the Manderleys opportunists, others welcomed a stable presence. Jon recognized that the north was once again fracturing along old lines. Perhaps he had only made it easier for them to feud. But he swallowed his regret, continuing on. When they reached the neck, the swamps and bogs tested their endurance. At Moat Cailin, they found a palisade manned by a mixed group of crannogmen and northern soldiers. Arya introduced herself, and they let her pass, but when they recognized Jon, they hissed curses about the burning of Winterfell. Arya defused the tension, saying they had urgent business to the south. The soldiers let them go reluctantly. Ghosts snarled if any drew too near, but no blood was shed. All this travel only underscored how deeply Jon's action had reshaped the north. Fear and uncertainty reigned. Where once people looked to Winterfell for stability, they now saw only a gaping absence. Even if Sansa or Robb had made mistakes in their reign, Winterfell had been a constant. Now it was ashes, courtesy of Jon Snow. In quiet moments, Arya would shake her head. She did not speak the words aloud, but Jon knew she was thinking it. "This is all because of you." He wondered how many times he'd have to relive that truth before his heart froze over entirely. The further south they traveled, the warmer the air grew, but he felt only a colder sense of isolation within. Arya pressed on, determined to find Bran. She asked for rumors in small taverns and roadside inns. Some said they'd seen a young man in a wheeled chair traveling with companions. Others claimed he moved on foot now, though it made little sense. Still others believed he had become some kind of green man in the neck, communing with the children of the forest. The stories varied, but one consistent thread persisted. The boy who had been king for a short time, with the power of ravens in his eyes, roamed the land in search of something. Or perhaps he was simply drifting like a leaf in the wind. Finally, in the ruin of a long-abandoned sept near the borders of the Riverlands, they found a clue. A hermit living among the broken stones said he had seen a quiet boy with eyes too old for his years, passing by not more than a fortnight ago. The hermit indicated the boy had headed west, deeper into the Riverlands. Arya thanked him and set off. Jon followed, silent, his chest tight with anticipation and dread. If they found Bran, would he pass judgment? Would he even care? Days of travel in the Riverlands brought them to a small clearing near a marshy lake. There, at last, they found him. Bran Stark sat beneath a twisted weirwood tree that rose from a patch of muddy ground, its roots thick and pale, forming a natural seat. He wore simple robes, brown and green, blending with the forest. His hair was longer, and his expression distant. No crown, no sigils, no entourage. Just a single companion who stood at a distance. A woman with eyes like green glass, a cranaguman possibly, or a child of the forest in partial disguise. She faded into the underbrush when Jon and Arya approached. Bran's gaze shifted to them with an eerie calm. Arya dismounted in a rush, her breath catching in her throat. "Bran," she called. He inclined his head, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Jon followed suit, dismounting stiffly. Ghost circled warily, sniffing the air. "Hello, Arya," Bran said, his voice soft, nearly lost amid the rustle of leaves. He turned to Jon, and in that moment, Jon felt laid bare, as though all his memories and sins were open to Bran's sight. "Jon," Bran acknowledged. Arya approached, kneeling by Bran. She searched his face for warmth, found only that curious detachment he had displayed since becoming the three-eyed raven. "We've been looking for you, Bran. Sansa is dead. Winterfell is—" She paused, flicking a glare at Jon. "Gone." Bran studied her, then Jon. "I know," he said. The wind stirred the white leaves of the weirwood, giving them a voice like hushed sighs. Arya's composure wavered. "You knew? You didn't try to stop him?" She gestured at Jon, whose face twisted with guilt. Bran's expression remained impassive. The choice was his to make. Anger colored Arya's cheeks. "That's all you have to say? He destroyed our home." Jon found himself stepping forward, though he felt unworthy to stand before Bran. "I did," he murmured. I'm sorry." Bran tilted his head, a subtle shift that made him seem more raven than man. "Are you sorry for the act, or for its consequences?" Jon did not know how to answer. He opened his mouth, closed it. Then he said, "Both. I thought it would free me and the realm from the burden of House Stark. Instead, I just caused more suffering." Arya knelt there, her hand clenched in the moss. Bran watched them both. "All things have consequences," he said. "There were other paths, but you chose yours." Arya's voice trembled. "Can you fix any of it? Can you use your power to rebuild Winterfell or restore what was lost?" Bran gazed at the weirwood trunk, his eyes almost glazing over. "I am not a god," he whispered. "I can see what was and what might be, but I cannot raise the dead or unburn the stones." A wave of hopelessness washed over Arya. She pressed her eyes shut. "Then what is left for us?" Bran turned his face to Jon, then Arya. "You are," he said plainly, as if that was explanation enough. Jon swallowed hard. "I don't understand." Bran's hands, resting in his lap, twitched slightly, as if he were recalling some distant memory. Winterfell was never just a castle. House Stark was never just a line of succession. Father taught us about honor, mother about love. We learned survival from the direwolves, and unity from each other. Those things you can't burn. You two stand here now, living proof that the Stark legacy endures, even if you set fire to the stones. Perhaps that legacy will survive in new ways. Arya's voice was a whisper. "But we're so broken, Bran." Bran met her eyes with a rare flicker of emotion. The North has always been broken, battered by winter, war, and ruin. Yet it endures. You endure. He let his gaze rest on Jon. Even you, Jon, who tried to end what you thought was a curse. Perhaps the true curse is never being free from love and duty. A Stark is always bound to them. Jon closed his eyes. A torrent of emotions churned in him. Guilt, anger at himself, sorrow, longing. "What do you want me to do, Bran? Kneel down and beg for forgiveness from the ghosts?" Bran blinked slowly. "Forgiveness is not mine to give, nor is it the ghosts." He paused. "Live, Jon. Live in a way that honors the love you once felt for Winterfell, whatever shape that takes. Help the people of the North, or wander as a hermit, or sail across the sea, or anything else. That is up to you. But do not expect the pain to fade. Pain and regret are as much a part of you now as your name." Arya stood, fists clenched. And you, Bran? Are you just going to wander, offering cryptic advice until we all die? A faint smile ghosted his lips. Perhaps, or perhaps I'm seeking something else. The world is larger than we ever imagined, Arya. We each have a path. Jon realized, with startling clarity, that no single conversation could heal the wounds between them. But perhaps Bran was right about one thing. They were still alive, still capable of doing something for the people around them. The nights in the wilderness had taught Jon that running only led to more nightmares. Maybe Arya was right about trying to protect those who yet lived, even if Winterfell was gone. He cleared his throat. Arya, he said tentatively, I can't ask you to accept what I've done, but if there's any chance we can work together to prevent the North from falling into chaos, maybe we can find a purpose. She regarded him, pain and reluctance etched in her expression. Then she nodded, as if acknowledging that she couldn't bear the burden alone. Bran looked on. Where will you go? He asked them both. Arya took a moment, closing her eyes. South, maybe, to see what the Manderleys are doing in White Harbor. If they're trying to claim leadership of the North, they might face resistance from the Umbers and the Glovers. Someone has to keep the peace. Jon hesitated. I can't imagine they'll welcome me. Arya shrugged. Probably not, but that might be all the more reason you should come. Own your deed. Stand for the people. If you truly regret it, show them you're willing to help. She looked at Bran. Will you come? Bran shook his head. Not yet. There's more I must learn here. His gaze drifted upward, and the wind stirred the weirwood's branches. We may meet again, though. Reluctantly, they parted ways with Bran under that ancient tree. Arya squeezed his hand, tears brimming in her eyes. You're still my brother, she whispered, even if everything else has changed. Bran's answering smile was distant, but there was a softness in his eyes. Jon stood a few feet away, feeling unsteady, as if he hovered on the edge of a great unknown. He gave Bran a slight bow, unsure if it was appropriate. Bran only nodded. Thus Jon and Arya headed east, then south, traveling through the riverlands where the scars of war lingered in half-ruined holdfasts and scorched fields. They encountered bandits, outlaws, and lords struggling to maintain order. Arya's skill with a blade and Jon's presence, haunted though it was, kept them safe. Ghosts scouted ahead, sometimes bringing back hares or small deer for their meals. At night, they shared uneasy fireside silences, and sometimes Arya would break the quiet with a question or a memory. Slowly, haltingly, a fragile bond began to reform between them, not the carefree sibling love they once knew, but something tempered by loss and betrayal. As they drew closer to White Harbor, the rumors swirled louder. Tensions were rising between the Manderleys and other northern lords. The Glovers accused them of overreach. The Umbers refused to bend the knee to pretender lords, and smaller houses like the Serwyns and Tallhearts were torn in allegiance. Word of Jon Snow's return spread, though the details were muddled. Some said he was returning to reclaim the North, others that he was leading an army of wildlings, still others that he carried the ashes of Winterfell in a sack. Superstitions abounded, fear took root, and the seeds of conflict were sown. Arya glared at the horizon as they rode. We'll do what we can to keep the peace, but you realize how they'll see you. Jon exhaled. I know, and maybe I deserve their anger, but I won't let the North tear itself apart if I can help it. Not again. He wondered if this was his penance, to toil endlessly to hold together the realm he had once tried to save by an act of destruction. Perhaps this was the price of his choice. They pressed on, uncertain of how they would be received, uncertain if they could truly mend the fractures. But at least they were trying together, and in that small measure, perhaps, lay the faintest glimmer of hope, a hope that outlasted even the downfall of Winterfell stones. And as for Winterfell itself, the snows would cover the blackened ruins. Over time, new growth might arise from the ashes. Life persisted. Memories lingered. The name Stark might fade from official rosters, but it would remain in stories and hearts, whispered by children near hearth fires, told by travelers who once saw the grand towers. And somewhere out there, In the quiet places of the world, Jon Snow carried that name in his soul, along with all the regret and love that came with it, forever bound by the legacy he had tried, yet failed to truly destroy. Jon Snow and Arya Stark rode on through the riverlands with the distant gull cries of White Harbor growing louder in rumor than in sound. For in truth they still had miles to go before the cold waters of the Bight rolled into view. The air grew damp with each league they passed, and the forests turned dense and tangled, as if resisting the approach of winter's hush. Ghost loped ahead, weaving through bracken and across narrow animal paths. Their journey had been as silent as it was tense. Each of them had words bound behind their teeth, regrets, memories, and worries that haunted them in the hush of the evening. They had parted from Bran in the glade near the weirwood, listening to him speak in that distant tone so reminiscent of a raven's call. He had given neither condemnation nor absolution, merely offered an understanding that could pierce one's chest deeper than any blade. Arya had left angry tears in the moss. Jon had left with a weariness that pressed on him like a millstone around his neck. Yet they both continued onward, determined to see whether the North could be saved from fraying into bitter factions. As they rode, every ruined holdfast and abandoned crofter's hut they passed reminded Jon of the ruin he had wrought at Winterfell. A twisted gate or a burned barn door would make his chest tighten. If once he could claim the moral high ground, fighting the good fight against the White Walkers, uniting the North, he could do so no longer. He had done something monstrous, even if his reasoning felt ironclad at the time. Now his entire existence was penance, or so it seemed. Arya, for her part, was neither warm nor cruel toward him. She occupied a space between blame and acceptance. Some evenings she'd share a memory, of Robb carrying her on his shoulders, of Sansa's needlework, of Ned Stark guiding them through the Godswood, and then she'd go quiet, as if the recollection brought her pain. On the third night after their departure from Bran, Jon found Arya sitting away from the small campfire, running her fingers over Needle, that precious sword she'd carried since youth. He approached her hesitantly. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded without looking up, still staring at the faint starlight playing across the sword's steel. "As right as I can be," she murmured. Then she turned her gaze on him. "Jon, I don't know if I'll ever forgive you. Maybe time will dull it. Maybe I'll wake up one morning and accept that Winterfell was doomed anyway. Or maybe I'll carry this anger until I die." Her eyes had an unguarded intensity that seared Jon more than any flame. "But you're still my brother, however twisted our shared blood might be. And there's too much to do for me to spend every day telling you how I feel. So we press on." Jon swallowed hard. He wanted to say he understood, but that felt hollow. He wanted to say he deserved her anger, which was true, but it felt equally empty. So he simply inclined his head. That small conversation ended with Arya sheathing Needle and returning to the fire, leaving Jon alone with Ghost's watchful red eyes. They passed into territory that once had been kept safe by the laws of old lords, Serwyn land, Umber land, even smaller baronies that had long since been ground to dust by successive wars. Now the roads were meager, teeming with refugees and peasants made landless. Most recognized Arya's Stark features, though not all knew her name, but all recognized Ghost padding silently behind them, as large as a small horse, his fur white as a new snowdrift. The sight of the dire wolf drew whispers and wide eyes. Some villagers bowed, hoping for northern courtesy. Others scurried away in fear, remembering rumors of savage beasts that traveled with legends. If they knew Jon Snow by name, they rarely spoke it, or else they cursed it under their breath. A few spat in the mud as he passed, calling him names too quiet to discern. It was enough to see the hostility etched in their faces. At dusk one day, they came across a small ring fort near a muddy stretch of farmland. The palisade walls were haphazard, reinforced with sharpened stakes that jutted out like rotted teeth. Banners hung from the ramparts, dull in the failing light, but Arya recognized the sigil as a minor branch of House Lockhart, long overshadowed by more powerful northern houses, but still clinging to identity. Their position was precarious, sandwiched between the Manderly sphere to the east and various fractious lords to the north. Jon and Arya rode up to the gate and asked for shelter for the night. The guard, a tall woman with a pike, scowled when she heard Jon's name, and it looked as though she might refuse them outright. Arya leveled a calm, lethal stare and said, "Any ill you have with him is ill you have with me, and trust you'd rather not." The woman swallowed her retort, and after a brief consultation with others inside the gate, allowed them entry. Within, the ring fort was cramped and damp, a cluster of huts around a central building that looked more barn than hall. A few scrawny goats were tied near a watering trough. The leader, a tired man with a limp and a weather-beaten face, introduced himself as Hally's Lockhart. He invited them into the main hall with evident reluctance. His clothes bore old patches, and his hair was graying, but his gaze was shrewd. "Lady Stark," he said, bowing to Arya, "we've heard word that you've been traveling. Did you come from the west?" Arya nodded. "We seek White Harbor." Hally's expression soured. "You'll find trouble there. The Manderleys are raising an army of sorts, or so the rumors go. They say it's for defense of the north, but the rest of us wonder if they mean to carve out a kingdom under their own banner." Jon listened silently, feeling the weight in Hally's stare. The man was clearly aware that Jon Snow, the infamous Stark bastard turned Targaryen claimant turned destroyer of Winterfell, sat at his table. Hally's Lockhart nodded politely toward Ghost, who lay near the hearth, then turned to Jon. "You'll find few welcomes, Snow. The north is in chaos. Some blame you for it outright. Others say the north was doomed anyway with no strong leadership. Either way, watch your back." Arya asked for more details. News of battles, alliances, or ravens from other lords. Hally's told them of how the Umbers still refused to bend the knee to anyone but a true Stark, how the Glovers demanded the Manderleys prove themselves in open council, and how the smaller houses, like Lockhart's own, were caught in the middle. "Winterfell was a beacon, for all its faults," Hally's muttered. "Now that it's gone, we're scattering like frightened hens." A restless hush followed. Arya's eyes flitted to Jon, then away. The next day, they departed, leaving the ring fort with little more clarity than before. Yet the tension in the air felt thicker now, as though the north itself lay on the brink of a new civil war. They traveled onward until at last they crested a ridge and glimpsed, in the far distance, the wide mouth of the White Knife River. The air smelled of salt and brine. White Harbor, the only city in the north that approached anything like the size and wealth of the southern strongholds, lay sprawled on the banks where the river met the sea. Its white limestone walls glimmered faintly in the watery sunlight. Merchant ships and fishing vessels dotted the harbor, sails flapping in the breeze. They could see, even from a distance, the new construction rising along the city's outer edges. Scaffoldings, half-finished walls, a bustle of labor. The Manderleys were building. Whether it was to expand or to fortify, they would soon find out. Jon felt a clench in his stomach. White Harbor had once stood loyal to House Stark, forging alliances that helped the North survive. But after everything that had happened, the War of the Five Kings, the war against the dead, the destruction of Winterfell, he wasn't sure what reception he and Arya would receive. Likely not a warm one. As they approached, the city guards at the northern gate blocked their path. They wore cloaks in Manderley blue-green, with a white merman device on their breasts. One stepped forward, a sturdy man with sun-chapped cheeks, eyeing Ghost warily. "State your names and business." Arya raised her chin. "Arya Stark. This is Jon Snow." A flicker of surprise crossed the guard's face, followed by an uncertain tension. "Arya Stark, you say? And Jon Snow?" He glanced at his companion. "The ones from the stories?" Jon clenched his jaw. "Aye." The man took a step back, clearly uncertain. Perhaps he had heard all manner of rumor. That Arya was a faceless assassin from Braavos, or that Jon was half-mad from Targaryen blood and had burned his own seat. In the end, the guard decided it was above his station to refuse them outright. He gave curt instructions. "You'll need to speak with Lord Wyman's grandson, Ser Marlin. He's overseeing the city guard right now. We'll escort you." They made their way through the cobbled streets, passing rows of houses that seemed in better condition than much of the north. Merchants hawked fish, salt, and cloth. The presence of Manderly soldiers was noticeable, patrolling in pairs, wearing mail and bearing sharp spears. Some of the citizens recognized Arya's stark face, or maybe they recognized the direwolf. A hush followed in her wake. Jon felt the weight of every eye on him, as though the entire city held its breath. They were brought to New Castle, the seat of House Manderly within the city walls, a fortress of pale stone with a thick gate and tall turrets. Inside the courtyard, workers hauled crates of supplies to and fro. The sound of hammering rang out from somewhere overhead. The guard led them to a wide hall that smelled of fresh-cut pine boards. The dais at the end was still being refurbished, complete with new tapestries along the walls depicting sea creatures and Manderly ancestors. Waiting there in a tall-backed chair was a heavy-set young man in fine clothes, likely in his early 20s, with a short, well-kept beard and bright eyes. Arya sized him up immediately. He rose to greet them, though the greeting came with careful formality. "Lady Arya Stark," he said, bowing just enough to be polite. "And you must be Jon Snow." He made no move to extend a hand, but neither was he overtly hostile. "I'm Marlon Manderly, Lord Wyman's grandson and castellan of New Castle in his absence." Jon returned a stiff nod. "We came to see how matters stand in the north," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "We've heard rumors of unrest." Marlon's eyes flicked between them, scanning for tells, for hidden agendas. "Yes," he said. "It's unfortunate. My father, Lord Wyllis, and my grandfather, Wyman, are further north negotiating with the Umbers or trying to. Meanwhile, I manage White Harbor in their stead." His tone suggested that the negotiations were not going particularly well. Arya wasted no time. "We're here to help. If the North tears itself apart, no one gains. And despite everything, House Stark's name still carries weight. Let us speak with your father or your grandfather." A stony expression flickered across Marlon's face. "You're welcome to do so, but be warned. They may not welcome Jon Snow so kindly. Some blame him for the dissolution of the North's unifying seat." He turned to Jon with a measured look. "My grandfather once said you were a good man, honorable if haunted. Now he hears you burned Winterfell. He might ask if the stories are true." Jon steeled himself. "They are true," he said quietly. "I won't lie about that." Arya shifted uncomfortably. She did not interrupt, though. The silence stretched until Marlon finally inclined his head. "Then we'll see how he receives you. For now, you may remain in White Harbor under guard. Your weapons will remain with you," he added with a nod to Arya. "But I trust you'll keep the peace." They were given modest rooms in a tower overlooking the bustling city. Ghost was allowed to stay in the courtyard, though he roamed with disquiet, baring his teeth at the city dogs. The next few days passed in a tense lull. Marlon went about his duties, overseeing the harbor's trade, ensuring the city's defenses were prepared. Arya and Jon tried to glean more about the wider realm. They learned that the Manderlys had indeed begun forging alliances, offering trade privileges to houses that supported them as de facto leaders of the North. Some lords were amenable, others resentful. Murmurs spoke of House Glover massing men around Deepwood Motte, and House Umber's new lord, still young, hot-blooded, refusing any compromise unless a true Stark led the North. On the third day, as Jon was pacing the tower corridor, a messenger arrived. "Lord Wyman requests your presence. He's expected to return within a day's time. He asks you both to wait in the Great Hall this evening." The messenger spoke with a polite aloofness that set Jon's nerves on edge. At dusk, Jon and Arya descended to the Great Hall, accompanied by a small retinue of guards. The hall had been decorated anew. Fine sea-green drapes behind the dais, silver candelabras, a row of new benches. Soldiers and servants bustled, preparing for the arrival of the aging lord who had once served as a staunch ally to the Starks. When Lord Wyman Manderly finally strode in, accompanied by his son Wyllis and a gaggle of armed retainers, the air in the hall changed. Wyman had grown older and even heavier, leaning on a cane. His wide face was set in grave lines, yet he still exuded a certain presence, a cunning that had survived many trials. His watery blue eyes swept over the hall, landing on Arya first. A spark of recognition flickered, old gratitude perhaps for how the Starks had once guided and protected White Harbor. Then his gaze landed on Jon, and the lines at the corners of his mouth tightened. Arya bowed her head in respect. "Lord Wyman," she said, "you look hale, considering these troubled times." "Lady Arya Stark," Wyman said, voice carrying a hint of warmth. "You've grown since last we met, though I recall you as a fierce little thing even then. If the tales are to be believed, you've become quite the traveler." He turned to Jon. "Jon Snow, the one-time king in the north, the Targaryen heir, the man who burned Winterfell. You have quite the string of titles." Jon inclined his head, face drawn. "I won't pretend to justify myself. I did what I did. I regret it. If that's not enough to earn your hearing, I'll leave." A quiet hush descended. Wyman thumped his cane on the floor. "You'll earn my hearing, boy. If only because your father in all but blood, was the best man I ever knew. Ned Stark. I can't fathom he'd want me to turn you away without a word." He shifted his weight. "But don't expect me to coddle you," Arya interjected. "We came to see if we can help unify the North. We know that the Umbers and Glovers are at odds with your push for leadership. They claim only a Stark can be the warden of the North." Wyman's expression hardened. "I tried to reason with them. The Stark line is in ashes, they say, and the only living kin, besides yourself, burned their ancestral seat. They refuse to bend. My boy Wylis has spent the last month parleying with them. They demanded a mood of sorts, but no one can agree on neutral ground since Winterfell is gone. My patience is fraying." Arya looked at Wyman's son, Wylis, who stood a step behind his father, quieter, with a subdued manner. Wylis nodded once, confirming what Wyman said. Jon cleared his throat. "Is there any chance they'll listen to Arya? She is a Stark by name and by blood. Perhaps she can serve as a neutral figure to bring them to the table." Wyman's gaze slid to Arya, considering. "Possibly, though the Umbers are a proud lot, and the Glovers might not trust a single soul after the wars. Still, you're right that the Stark name carries meaning. But you, Jon, your presence might do more harm than good." Jon said nothing. He had expected as much. Arya frowned, stepping closer. "I won't go without him. If these lords want the truth, they should face Jon. Let them look into his eyes. If they want to call him an oathbreaker or a traitor, let them do it to his face, not whisper behind closed doors." Wyman let out a slow breath through his nose. "You are as headstrong as ever, my lady. Very well. I'll arrange a parley under strict truce, near the land between the Last Hearth and White Harbor. There's an old ring fort by the fork in the King's Road, though I don't know if it'll hold everyone comfortably. But it's neutral enough no house claims it as their seat. We'll send ravens to all the major northern houses, summoning them to attend and speak for the future of the North." "And if they refuse?" Arya asked. Wyman's lips pressed thin. "Then we see who truly wants peace. I can't force them all, but if they ignore the summons of a Stark, well..." He trailed off, letting the statement hang. Arya and Jon exchanged glances. It was a gamble, but perhaps the only path that didn't involve open conflict among the Northern Lords. If they could gather in one place, maybe they could be persuaded to form a new structure of leadership, something that didn't rest entirely on one seat or one name. Jon felt an ache of remorse. Perhaps this was the kind of gathering that should have happened before he burned Winterfell. Now the ghosts of that decision would loom over every conversation. So began a flurry of preparation in White Harbor. Ravens were dispatched, sealed with Arya's name and the Manderly sigil, urging the lords to come to the ring fort. The letter made no secret of Jon's presence, stating that he would be there to answer for his deed. Whether that would attract the lords or repel them was anyone's guess. Wyman busied himself with provisioning wagons, mustering soldiers to ensure the parley was protected from bandits or saboteurs. He insisted on a strong armed presence. There were too many opportunists in the North nowadays, men who might want to seize advantage of a gathering of notables. Arya spent the days checking over her gear, ensuring her mount was well fed, needle was sharpened, and her travel pack in order. Jon found himself restless in the tower, the eyes of the city still judging him. Sometimes, at night, he would walk the harbor's edge with Ghost, the salt wind ruffling his hair. He watched the ships bob on the tide, listened to the drunken laughter from waterfront taverns. He felt like a man suspended in time, uncertain if his next breath would lead him to redemption or push him further into damnation. Now and then, Arya joined him, standing at his shoulder, neither of them speaking. Her presence was the only thing keeping him anchored in some sense of family, even though he felt the rift between them as keenly as a knife's edge. Within a week, word returned from several houses. The Glovers responded in the affirmative, albeit with sharp words. They would attend, but only under the strictest neutrality. The Umbers, likewise, grudgingly agreed, adding a scrawled note that if they saw any sign of Manderly ambition or Targaryen madness, they would ride away. Minor houses like Cerwyn, Tallheart, and Locke also sent acceptance. Others did not respond, or sent uncertain replies, likely waiting to see if a real parley would materialize. Wyman decided that was sufficient to proceed. He assigned his son Wylis and his grandson Marlon to manage affairs in White Harbor while he, with a moderate escort, joined Arya and Jon on the march north to the Ringfort. They departed just after dawn on a crisp morning. The wind carried a promise of the coming winter, though it was not here in earnest yet. Wyman rode in a comfortable litter pulled by mules, his bulk making long rides on horseback difficult. 100 men marched as his guard, equipped with decent armor and armed with spears and crossbows. Arya and Jon rode ahead, occasionally scouting. Ghost prowled the flanks, letting out low growls at suspicious sounds in the thickets. The roads were not as busy this far north, though they encountered small groups of travelers, most with worried faces, hurrying to safer lands. Each night they camped in makeshift clearings. Wyman made sure no one challenged Jon openly, but the atmosphere was uneasy. Some of the soldiers muttered about Bastard Targaryen or the Burner of Winterfell. Jon ignored them or tried to. Arya's presence deterred most open scorn, but the resentment was there, a tangible thing as they huddled around fires under star-clouded skies. On the 5th evening of travel, they reached the Ringfort. It stood on a low hill by the fork in the old King's Road. The ramparts had collapsed in places, and the interior held only the remnants of ancient walls, but it was defensible enough. A few tents had already been pitched, bearing the sigils of House Cerwyn and House Tallheart. The arrival of the Manderly contingent with a Stark in tow caused quite a stir. Arya dismounted, receiving awkward bows from the men who recognized her. Jon stood off to the side, leading Ghost to a patch of grass. The direwolf's presence scattered those who didn't know better, but at least it gave Jon some space. They waited. Over the next 2 days, more banners appeared on the horizon. House Glover arrived, led by an older man with a hardened face. Lord Galbart Glover had passed, and this was his cousin Naton, who eyed Jon with open disdain. House Locke, House Cerwyn, some Ryswell men, a few from the Bar Rowlands, all trickled in. Each group had come prepared for trouble, weapons at the ready. The air buzzed with suspicion, as if a single spark might ignite a fight. Finally, a swirl of dust appeared in the distance, heralding the Umbers. The Lord Umber, who insisted on being called Lord Jon Umber, ironically sharing a name with Jon Snow, was a tall, broad-shouldered youth, fiery of hair and temper. He was joined by older bannermen and a retinue of savage-looking riders. They strode into camp, ignoring the polite greetings. Umber's eyes went straight to Jon Snow, narrowing like a hawk's. "So the rumors are true," he snarled. "You dare show your face after destroying our seat of power?" Jon lifted his chin, though he felt no pride. I'm here." Arya stepped in quickly. "Lord Umber, the parley demands courtesy. We're here to talk, not trade insults." Lord Umber huffed. "You're the only Stark left who matters, Arya. You I can respect. But him." He jabbed a meaty finger at Jon. "He's no Stark. He's a Targaryen bastard. And he's the one who robbed us of Winterfell." All eyes turned to Jon. Wyman cleared his throat, urging calm. But no one spoke in Jon's defense. Not even Arya. She simply set her jaw. Finally, Jon said quietly, "Then let me speak for my actions. If you would at least grant me that much." The group assembled within the ring fort's largest clearing, which had been lined with rough benches and a few tables. Soldiers ringed the perimeter, each house with its own guard. The tension lay thick as they settled, the breeze flapping banners overhead. Arya, Wyman, Glover, Umber, Serwyn, Tallheart, and several others took seats. Jon stood at the periphery, Ghost by his side, as if on trial. Wyman began with formal greetings, recounting the necessity of this gathering. The North needed unity, a recognized leadership, or at least a council that could bring order. He gestured for Arya to speak. She stood, slim and dark-eyed, and told them plainly that she had come home to find her sister dead, her brother Bran wandering as the three-eyed raven, and Winterfell in ashes because of Jon's choice. She said she did not forgive it, but she had chosen to stand by him in seeking a better path for the North. "We can't undo the past," Arya said, voice clear, "but we can shape the future. If you want House Stark to lead, well, I am here, but I don't want 1,000 fealties. I want to hear your thoughts on what the North needs now." Murmurs spread through the lords. Nathan Glover shook his head. "How can we trust a Stark who didn't even know her father's seat was being burned? You were off in foreign lands. Why should we kneel to you now?" Arya bristled, but Wyman intervened with a wave of his hand, reminding Glover that no one had asked for kneeling, only for open conversation. Then Lord Umber rose, face red with controlled fury. "What conversation is there? If Winterfell is gone, we need a new seat for the North. That much is clear. Some say White Harbor. Others say we spread authority among multiple houses. But we do not any. A Targaryen scum telling us what to do. This Jon Snow has done enough harm." All eyes fell on Jon. He inhaled slowly, stepping into the clearing center. Ghost rose, hackles subtly raised, but Jon gestured for the direwolf to remain calm. "I understand your anger," Jon said quietly. "I know you blame me for taking Winterfell from the North. I did that. There's no denying it. I believed, at the time, that by destroying Winterfell, I might break the cycle of wars waged in House Stark's name. I was wrong. Instead, I brought you more chaos. For that, I'm sorry, and I don't ask for your forgiveness." An uneasy hush followed. The lords exchanged glances. Jon continued, voice steady but sad. "If you demand my life in exchange, I won't resist. I've been living in the snow for months, prepared to die. But Arya convinced me to come here because we both believe there's a better way. It's not about me or a throne. It's about you, about the North. You can kill me and remain leaderless, or you can try to find a path that helps your people survive the winters yet to come." The stark honesty of his words seemed to unsettle them. Arya watched with tense eyes, her knuckles whitening. If someone leapt forward to kill Jon, she would not stand aside, that much was clear. But no one moved. A few looked at each other uneasily, as if expecting someone else to call for Jon's head. Lord Umber grumbled under his breath, fists clenched. Glover stared hard at Jon, but made no move for a blade. Wyman took the chance to speak. "We cannot dismiss the leadership question. Arya is right. If she is the only remaining Stark in Westeros, besides Bran, who is unavailable, should she not stand as the head of House Stark and lead us? Or, if not, do we choose a new house to guide the North? The Manderleys have no desire to claim dominion by force, but we are prepared to keep order if no one else will." That sparked a wave of objections. House Glover insisted they did not need to be ruled by White Harbor. House Serwyn argued the same. Some older voices claimed the Manderleys, once exiled from the South, did not have the old blood of the First Men. The conversation spiraled into bickering, though no one drew steel. Arya eventually raised her voice. "Enough squabbling. We have bigger concerns. Winter is not far off. Harvests have been poor, and we have bandits roaming the North. Let's form a council of houses. Choose representatives, handle disputes together, and muster a combined defense if needed." It was a bold suggestion. The North had historically rallied behind a single great house. But with Winterfell gone, the seat vacant, and trust in tatters, a council might be the only workable structure. The lords considered it. Some muttered that it would weaken any chance of a unified front. Others saw potential in shared rule. Wyman pressed the idea, pointing out that White Harbor was strong in trade and resources, while the Umbers, Glovers, and other houses excelled in military might or farmland. Together, they could function. If separate, they might fall. Jon stood aside, letting them argue. He felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe there was a path forward that did not revolve around him or a single Stark. He caught Arya's eye once, seeing the determined set of her jaw. She was not the little girl who once chased cats through Winterfell's halls. She was a hardened woman, a traveler, an assassin, a survivor. Her presence alone might convince them where pure logic failed. By nightfall, the lords had agreed to a temporary measure. They would form a northern council with 7 seats, one for each major region or powerful house grouping. They would rotate leadership each season, or so the initial plan suggested. The Manderleys and Umbers would each hold a seat, as would the Glovers, and then 4 others, to be determined among the lesser houses. Arya Stark would serve as a sort of mediator or tiebreaker, an honorable presence bridging old traditions and the new. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a start. At the mention of Arya's role, Lord Umber bristled. And what of him? He jerked his chin at Jon. Jon Snow, the so-called hero who undid the Stark seat. Where does he fit in this council? Jon swallowed, stepping forward. I fit nowhere. I'm not here to rule. Let me do what good I can as a mediator as well, or let me leave if that's what you wish. I only want to see the North stable. Some lords sneered at the idea. Others were uncertain. Arya spoke quietly. He has knowledge of warfare and a history of uniting men against impossible odds. He might be useful even if you don't trust him. And if he wants no official seat, perhaps he can act as an advisor to whomever will have him. Umber spat. I'll never take his advice. But if the rest of you want to, I won't stand in your way. As long as I don't have to call him my lord. Tension rippled, but gradually the lords settled into wary acceptance. Jon felt no pride in their grudging tolerance. He only felt an unsteady relief that they might not kill him on the spot. The night ended in an uneasy truce. Soldiers from each house patrolled different segments of the ring fort, sharing guarded nods, but no one challenged steel. Arya and Jon retreated to their tent, exhausted. Inside, Arya slumped onto a small stool, letting out a long breath. That went better than I thought, she admitted. We have the beginnings of a plan. Jon nodded. Ghost lay at his feet, muzzle on paws. Aye, it's a step, but the plan won't hold unless the lords truly commit. She rested her arms on her knees, staring at the lantern's glow. I'll do what I can. This council idea, it's not the old ways, but maybe that's the point. The old ways are gone with Winterfell. Her voice caught slightly at the mention of their lost home, but she pressed on. I'll have to keep them from tearing each other's throats out. And you, she lifted her eyes to him. I can help, if they'll let me. He lowered his gaze. It's ironic, isn't it? I destroyed the seat to avoid these games. Yet here I am, playing them once more. Arya's lips curved in a faint, sardonic smile. Life rarely cares about what we want. She rose, crossing the tent. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll have to finalize the seats on this council. That means more squabbling. Jon watched as she slipped out of the tent, likely to check the perimeter or speak with Wyman. He exhaled shakily. Perhaps if they forged this council, the North could endure. Perhaps men would stop trying to kill him or enthrone him. Perhaps. But the old ghosts of Winterfell would not depart so easily. In the days that followed, they hammered out details. 7 seats, representing White Harbor, Manderley, the Last Hearth, Umber, Deepwood Motte, Glover, the Bar Rowlands, houses like Dustin, Ryswell, and others, collectively choosing 1 representative. The smaller central houses, Serwyn, Tallheart, Locke, etc. The mountainous clans near the Vale border, and a seat for the rightful Stark, which in this case meant Arya, who could name a steward if she was absent. This structure was loose, open to revision, but it was enough to stave off immediate rebellion. Jon offered suggestions here and there, especially on how to handle the defense of roads and trade routes, something he had learned from his time as Lord Commander. Some lords listened grudgingly, others scoffed. Arya would cut through arguments with short, biting remarks, or else stand aside and let them tire themselves out. Wyman soothed tempers when they grew hot, ever the cunning diplomat. The ring fort bustled with new life. Tents, cook fires, the clang of blacksmiths. A final assembly was scheduled, where all would affirm the Council of the North in front of their men. That evening, a raw wind swept the campsite. Jon walked the perimeter with Ghost, ensuring no trouble brewed among the assembled soldiers. He sensed eyes on him constantly, some curious, some hateful, some fearful, but no one confronted him. He was almost to the edge of the fort, where the palisade half collapsed into a ditch, when he noticed a hooded figure slip away into the darkness. Ghost snarled softly, the hair on his neck rising. Jon's instincts flared. He followed. Outside the ring fort, in a small copse of twisted trees, the figure stood as if waiting. Jon approached cautiously, hand on the hilt of Long Claw. Ghost flanked him. A voice came from the hood, low and raspy. "Jon Snow, you truly walk with that white wolf, as they say." He halted. "Who are you?" The figure pulled back the hood, revealing a weathered woman's face, middle-aged, with scars crossing her jaw and brow. She wore furs reminiscent of northern mountain folk. "Name's Keisha. I ride with House Umber. Word is you burned your own seat. That's a monstrous deed, but might be exactly what we needed." Jon frowned. "I don't follow." She gave a grim smile. "I lost kin at the Red Wedding, served under your brother Robb. My father was butchered. I saw all the horrors that came of houses fighting for a seat that couldn't protect them from betrayal. You want to know what I think? Maybe that seat was cursed. Maybe we all needed it gone." The wind shifted, rustling the branches overhead. Jon let out a breath, uncertain how to respond. All he'd heard so far was condemnation. Now this woman claimed his deed might have released them from a cycle of bloodshed, albeit at a terrible price. "I'm not proud of it," he said quietly. She snorted. "Nor should you be. But folks up here know about paying harsh prices to survive. The Umber lad is full of anger, but some of us see a chance to build something new, free of ancient ghosts. We'll see if this council works." She flicked a glance at Ghost, then back to Jon. "Just thought you should know not all of us want your head on a spike. We'll be watching." With that, she pulled her hood back up and melted into the darkness. Jon stared after her, shaken. Maybe a handful of people in the North could see a twisted logic in his actions, or at least see them as impetus for change. It didn't make him feel absolved, but it did ease that crushing sense of being universally reviled. He returned to the fort, heart pounding, Ghost padding softly at his side. The next morning, the final assembly took place. Each representative of the soon-to-be council stood in the ring fort center. Arya stood among them, shoulders square, scanning the watchers. The soldier throngs and lesser lords gathered around. Jon remained near the edge with Wyman Manderly, who, leaning on his cane, oversaw the formalities. One by one, each representative declared a tentative acceptance of the council, vowing to protect the North together, to share resources, and to remain prepared for winter. The oaths were not grandiose. Most men were too weary for lofty speeches, but they were spoken in the presence of all, forging a fragile unity. Arya, as the last living Stark of Winterfell's line in the North, placed a hand on each representative's shoulder in turn, symbolic of the old bonds. Some lords seemed to do so grudgingly, but they did it nonetheless. Afterward, to finalize the arrangement, Arya took a small dagger and cut the palm of her hand, letting a single drop of blood fall onto the ground where the ring fort's old keep had once stood. "The Starks are of the North," she said, voice carrying. "Winterfell was our seat, but the land is our heritage. If any man defies this council out of petty greed or tries to break the North for his own ambition, remember this day." Her tone was steeled. "I will be watching." A hush followed, broken only by the wind. Jon saw a flicker of awe on some faces. Arya might not be the Lady of Winterfell in the old sense, but she wore the mantle of a Stark in that moment. Even Lord Umber, standing with arms folded, seemed impressed, however grudgingly. The new council members exchanged solemn nods, acknowledging that this vow meant something. Whether it would hold when tested was another question entirely. That evening, the ring fort turned celebratory in a cautious way. People shared food, though the supplies were limited. Soldiers relaxed, some joked. A few casks of ale were cracked open. Arya circulated, speaking quietly with the lords, ensuring no rancor festered. Wyman watched everything with a keen eye, sipping from a tankard. Jon kept to the edges, feeling more like a specter than a guest. A few times, men approached him, some curious, some resentful, but none overtly hostile. He answered their questions bluntly, repeated his regrets, and said he sought no leadership role. That honesty seemed to defuse tensions more effectively than any grand speech could. Late in the evening, Arya found Jon by a burned-out fire pit, where a small group of men had left for their tents. Ghost lay beside him, dozing. She sat on a log next to Jon, letting out a long breath. "It's a start," she said. He nodded. "Yes, I wonder if they'll keep to it once we're gone." She shrugged. "They might. The North is stubborn, but they know they need each other. Winter is harsh." She pulled her cloak tighter. "What will you do, Jon?" He looked at her, brow furrowing. "Help them if they ask. Otherwise, I might return north of the wall. Tormund is there. The free folk are no threat these days. They just want to live free." He paused, searching Arya's expression. "Unless you'd have me stay." Arya studied the embers in the fire pit. "I'm not sure where I'll go either. Part of me wants to remain here, anchor this council, make sure it works. Another part of me wants to roam the edges of the world again. But that might be running away." Jon nodded in understanding. "You and I, maybe we never were meant for sitting in great halls, wearing cloaks of office. We're both too restless." A silence fell, heavy with unspoken sorrow for all they'd lost. Then Arya spoke, voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes I dream of Winterfell, but it's always on fire, or the walls are missing, or the courtyard is empty. I guess that's our reality now." Jon's chest tightened. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know it doesn't help." She exhaled. "No, it doesn't. But at least you're here, trying to make up for it." She rose, giving him a measured look. "I'm still angry, Jon. Likely always will be. But we have each other in some strange sense. That's worth something." He bowed his head, grateful for even that small concession. "Thank you." The next morning, the camp began to break. The lords prepared to depart, each returning to their domain with the promise to convene the new council in a few moons' time. Wyman Manderly left with his retinue for White Harbor, inviting Arya to come if she wished to keep an eye on matters there. Arya remained undecided. The Umbers marched home, half likely to seethe at the arrangement but at least not raising arms yet. The Glovers moved on too. The Barrowland lords drifted away. The ring fort emptied by midday, leaving only a scattering of tents and a sense of hollow aftermath. Arya and Jon lingered. She was restless, pacing near the old walls. "I need to see for myself how the North fares," she told Jon at last. "I might ride with Wyman to White Harbor, then travel to the other houses, check on the small folk, ensure that the council's promises aren't just words. Will you come?" Jon hesitated. "They might not want me interfering." Arya gave him a pained smile. "Yes, but they might need it all the same. And if some threat arises, be it bandits or lords ignoring the agreement, your sword and your sense of honor could help. But if your heart is calling you back beyond the wall, I can't stop you." He glanced north, as if he could see the vast wilderness from here. Part of him longed for that simplicity. Yet he knew Tormund had parted from him, unwilling to watch Jon's self-destruction. Perhaps there was still a place for him among the free folk, but a larger part of him felt compelled to stay. He owed that debt to Arya and to the North. "I'll stay," he said quietly. "For now." Arya nodded, relief flickering behind her eyes. Good. They made a plan to ride to White Harbor, gather supplies, and then roam the north in a small band, calling on houses to ensure the council's cooperation. Wyman had offered them a retinue if they wished, but Arya refused, preferring to travel light. Jon was content with that, though he wondered if a larger guard might dissuade ambushes. Arya pointed out that too large an armed escort might be viewed as intimidation. "We want them to trust us, not see us as conquerors," she reasoned. Thus began another journey, one not guided by the single goal of forging a treaty, but by the broader task of seeing it upheld. Over the next weeks, they crisscrossed the north, traveling roads that led through thick pine forests and across rolling hills. They visited House Serwyn, where they found a pragmatic lord who pledged to keep the council's word and muster resources for a new system of trade. They went to House Tallheart, repairing fortifications and worried about bandits from the west. They passed near the Dreadfort's old domain, though House Bolton was gone, wiped out during the wars. The keep itself stood as a rotting husk, rumored to be haunted. Arya forbade them from going near it. "We have enough ghosts," she said. Everywhere they went, they met a mixture of responses: suspicion, relief, anger, gratitude, fear. A few men challenged Jon to answer for Winterfell. Arya would stand at his side, silent, watchful. Jon would face them with quiet resolve, repeating his regrets, explaining that he sought no throne. Slowly, some of the hatred cooled, replaced by wary acceptance. Ghost's presence helped as well. The direwolf was a reminder of the old magic in House Stark, an echo of the direwolf sigil that once flew over Winterfell. The greatest test came in the Barrowlands, where rumors spoke of a bandit lord styling himself as the Ghost of the North, raiding small villages and seizing supplies. Arya and Jon tracked these brigands, following the trail of burnt farms and robbed caravans. When they finally caught up with them, a ragged group of 30 men skulking in the ruins of an old tower, Jon and Arya confronted them. The bandit leader spat at the mention of House Stark and accused them of abandoning the North. Arya retorted that the new council existed precisely to protect the people. The bandits attacked, forcing a bloody fight in the fading light. Arya moved with lethal grace, needle flashing. Jon fought with an economy of motion, long claw cleaving through the gloom. Ghost leapt on foes, snarling. In minutes, it was over. The bandit leader lay dying, cursing them both. Jon knelt by him, hearing the man's last words. "You destroyed your own home? Who's to say you won't destroy ours?" Then he died, leaving Jon with that bitter echo. Even criminals scorned him for Winterfell. In the end, they put the bandits' surviving men in irons, delivered them to the local lords for justice. Arya said nothing about the man's final accusation, but the look she gave Jon was laced with empathy and sorrow. They pressed on, fulfilling their self-appointed mission of stabilizing the North. After weeks of constant travel, winter began to creep in earnest. The winds grew sharper, the nights longer. They returned to White Harbor to consult with Wyman Manderley and learned that, so far, none of the major houses had broken the council arrangement. There were disputes, but they were handled through letters or small gatherings. Relief flickered in Arya's eyes. Perhaps this council could hold. Perhaps the North would find a new equilibrium. Wyman thanked them for their efforts, calling Arya the Wolf of the North and Jon her gray shadow. But his tone was less mocking than it might have been once. He recognized that their trave, LS, had prevented at least a few crises. Another raven arrived around that time with a curious piece of news. A sighting of Bran Stark, or someone matching his description, near the Isle of Faces in the south. Arya felt an immediate tug to investigate, but Jon reminded her that traveling that far south in deepening winter could be perilous. She wavered, torn between her brother and her responsibilities in the north. In the end, she decided to hold off. "If he wishes to find us, he knows where we are," she said softly. "He always does." So the winter settled in. The nights grew bitter, and snow began to blanket the hills. Arya and Jon found themselves spending more nights in White Harbor, or accepted the hospitality of lesser lords. The uneasy acceptance of Jon Snow as an advisor to the new Northern Council became something like a norm, albeit always overshadowed by whispered questions of whether he could be trusted. Some men warmed to him after seeing his unwavering commitment to protecting villagers from bandits and to negotiating settlements over petty land disputes. Others never forgave him, or only tolerated his presence because Arya Stark was an unyielding shield at his side. Months passed in a swirl of council sessions, emergency rides to quell local feuds, and bracing themselves for the intensifying winter. Some small folk began to look to Arya and Jon as protectors, the wandering wolves who brought harsh justice or supplies in times of famine. The Mandalese continued building up White Harbor as a hub, ensuring trade ships carried southern grain to feed the north. The Umbers and Glovers overcame some of their animosity, focusing on keeping their roads open and patrolled. Slowly, quietly, a patchwork stability emerged. Late one evening, after returning from a mission to quell a dispute in the Barrowlands, Jon found himself perched on a parapet of White Harbor's outer wall. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes, swirling in the harbor's lights below. Ghost lay curled at his feet, eyes half closed. The city stretched out before him, the black sea beyond, dotted with anchored ships. Footsteps crunched behind him. He turned to see Arya, wrapped in a thick cloak. She moved lightly despite the snow and settled beside him on the stone. They stood in silence for a time, watching the snowfall. Eventually, Arya spoke in a soft voice that carried more warmth than before. "We're doing better than I expected. The North might survive this winter without descending into another war." Jon nodded. "Yes, I think so." She studied him sidelong. "Still dreaming of leaving?" He considered it. "Sometimes. But I see now that Winterfell was never just the walls. It was us, the Starks. Even with the castle gone, we still carry it in our hearts. I destroyed one symbol, but the meaning lives on. I suppose I should do what I can to honor that." A faint smile curved Arya's lips. "Ned Stark would have said something about duty. You might not share his blood in the strict sense, but you share his spirit more than you know, Jon." He felt a tightness in his chest. Hearing that was both a balm and a sorrow. "Thank you," he murmured. They gazed out over the harbor once more. The snow softened the sounds of the city. Waves lapped against the docks. Lanterns glimmered in windows. The hush was broken only by the soft hiss of wind. Finally, Arya turned to him, her breath visible in the cold air. "I'll never forget what you did, Jon, and I don't think I'll fully forgive. But She paused, swallowing. "I'm glad you stayed. We're making a difference. And for the North, that's what matters." Jon nodded. "Yes, for the North." They stood together on the wall, two survivors of a shattered house, each bearing scars that would never fully heal. The dire wolf at their feet was the last living emblem of a legacy thought destroyed. And in the falling snow, they found a moment of quiet understanding. House Stark had endured unspeakable trials, war, betrayal, the burning of its ancestral seat. Yet somehow, in the hearts of its last scions, it persisted. Jon Snow had tried to end that burden, only to find it followed him everywhere. Arya Stark had returned home too late, only to discover the fires of the past still smoldered. Now, together, they chose a path of perseverance, forging a fragile new shape for the North. The future remained uncertain. Rivalries could flare anew. Winter might prove harsher than expected. Bran's whereabouts were still a mystery, and perhaps the realm below the neck would hatch fresh intrigues. But for now, in that snowfall above the White Harbor battlements, Jon Snow and Arya Stark had a measure of unity, a measure of peace. And if ghosts walked the ashes of Winterfell, they would find that the living still fought on, guided by duty, love, regret, and the stubborn will of wolves. Neither sibling knew what the next season would bring, but they would face it side by side, carrying the memory of Winterfell in their souls, determined that if any new seat or banner rose in the North's name, it would stand for something more than the old cycles of blood. In that determination, maybe they found the smallest fragment of absolution, an absolution not given by gods or men, but by the simple act of doing what they could to protect those who called the North home. Days stretched into weeks, then into months, and the winter laid its icy hand on the land in earnest. Yet the dire wolf and the wolf girl and the man who was both a bastard and a king in truth moved through the realm, forging ties, delivering justice, warding off starvation. They arranged shipments of grain from across the seas, endured biting storms on the roads, and found themselves huddling in broken keeps that once belonged to houses destroyed by the long wars. At each stop, they were reminded that Winterfell's demise had not erased the North's spirit. People adapted. Life carried on. The council's structure, while imperfect, continued to function enough to stave off chaos. Laughter rose in small taverns. Children played in the snow. Old men recalled days gone by. Hope quietly pulsed beneath the ice. Jon Snow, for his part, finally felt some flicker of belonging. Not in the sense of titles or banners, but in the daily work of ensuring families survive the winter. Perhaps that was always what he was meant to do. Protect people, not rule them. The nightmares of Winterfell aflame still haunted him, but now he awoke with a sense of purpose. Sometimes he found Arya standing guard outside his door, silent, as if she too were plagued by the ghosts of their old home. Neither spoke of it, but their shared burden became a bond stronger than any vow. When spring finally showed signs of stirring, fragile buds peeking from thawing earth, word reached them that House Umber was hosting a gathering to discuss trade routes for the next year. Invited to attend, Arya and Jon journeyed to the newly fortified stockade near the last hearth. They arrived to find the air still crisp with lingering snowdrifts, but the mood decidedly more optimistic. Lord Umber, young, fiery, greeted them with a grunt of acknowledgement rather than open scorn. He nodded to Arya, who gave him a respectful bow. Then he eyed Jon. "Still alive, eh?" he muttered. Jon answered evenly, "Still here." A faint smirk tugged at the corner of Umber's mouth. He said no more, turning to lead them inside. That silent acceptance spoke volumes. Over the weeks, the memory of the new council's oath and Arya's presence had tempered even the Umber's ire, enough that they would at least treat Jon with some civility. Inside, they found a modest gathering of lords from smaller houses. Talks on trade, replanting, and resettling the empty lands south of the wall followed. Arya's voice commanded respect. Jon's input carried weight. As the day wore on, a workable plan emerged. Surplus from White Harbor would travel north. The Umbers would supply timber and manpower to rebuild roads, and the Bar-Rollins would assist in forging new trade routes to the Neck. Each step was slow, incremental, but it was a new shape forming in the North's governance, a shape that did not revolve around a single seat or a single name. That evening, after more negotiations, Lord Umber approached Jon quietly in a corner of the Great Hall. The flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Ghost lay in a corner, half asleep. Arya was speaking with a group of lesser lords near the hearth. Umber folded his thick arms across his chest. "Snow, I still think you have the madness of Targaryens in you, but I can't deny you've done some good these past months. My people are fed, the roads are safer, and no army stands at my gates demanding fealty." Jon met his gaze. "That was always the goal." Umber nodded grudgingly. "Yeah, well, keep on that path. You step off it, I'll be the first to put an axe in your skull." The threat lacked the venom it once held, more a statement of blunt northern honesty than imminent danger. Jon nodded in understanding, and Umber stomped away. It was a strange form of acceptance, but acceptance nonetheless. At last, after so many miles traveled, so many nights spent in uncertainty, the North began to show glimpses of genuine recovery. Arya and Jon, the two wolves without a den, became an almost legendary pair among the common folk. Children would peek from behind fences, whispering about the White Wolf Man and the lady with the needle sword. Some told stories that they were the ghosts of Ned Stark's lost children. Others believed they were a new kind of sentinel, ensuring the North never fell prey to the evils of the past. Jon found the stories uncomfortable, but Arya sometimes smiled at the children, remembering a time when she too had hidden behind corners with wide-eyed wonder. Winter turned to a timid spring, then grew into a mild summer. The Council of the North was tested by disputes, quarrels over borders, renewed tensions with mountain clans, but it held together. Arya would often ride forth to quell trouble, accompanied by Jon and Ghost. Wyman Manderley managed White Harbor's continued growth, forging new trade alliances with the Vale. The Glovers secured the coastline to the west, mindful of any Ironborn raids. The Umbers patrolled the northern roads, turning away would-be brigands. The Barrow landlords, so often overshadowed by larger houses, found a voice in the council, championing the needs of smaller folk. In time, respect grew among them, not the feudal subservience of old, but a grudging camaraderie shaped by necessity. Throughout all this, Jon and Arya rarely spoke of Winterfell's ashes, but the memory lingered. Once, as they camped under a bright moon, Arya quietly admitted that she wished to scatter something, some token, on the site of the old castle, to honor their lost family. Jon's throat tightened. He had avoided that place since the day he set it aflame, but he owed Arya. So, when the next council meeting was scheduled in the central region, they diverted their path. Soon, they stood at the edge of the ruin that had once been the seat of House Stark. Time and the elements had conspired to soften the blackened stones. Vines and wildflowers crept over collapsed walls. Snowmelt filled the old moat with stagnant water. The great keep was a jagged skeleton of stone. The courtyard was unrecognizable, choked with rubble. No trace of the weirwood remained in the godswood, only a charred, twisted stump, half buried in new growth. Jon felt his heart clench at the sight. Ghost whimpered softly, as though sensing the sorrow that lived in these stones. Arya dismounted, stepping carefully over chunks of masonry. She found a patch of scorched earth that might once have been the place she practiced with her bow. With trembling hands, she withdrew a small, woven token from her pouch. She knelt and placed it on the ground. Jon recognized it as a scrap of cloth Sansa had once embroidered with a direwolf motif, saved through countless trials by Arya's quiet sentiment. Arya pressed it into the soil, then whispered words that Jon couldn't quite catch, perhaps a farewell or a prayer to the old gods. Jon watched, silent, the weight in his chest heavier than ever. After a long moment, Arya rose. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She caught Jon's gaze, then looked at the ruin around them. "This was our home," she said softly. "It's gone now, but we're still here. I guess that's something." Jon stepped forward, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. He said nothing. Words were inadequate to convey the swirl of remorse and longing within him. But Arya accepted the gesture, leaning into his arm for a fleeting moment. Then she turned, leading them back to the horses. The wind whispered through the broken walls, carrying away the last echoes of House Stark's old grandeur. They left the ruin behind, two survivors forging a new legacy in the wide, cold north. In the following months, talk sprang up among some northern folk of rebuilding Winterfell. A new castle on the old site, or perhaps somewhere else. Others said to let it lie, a monument to the cost of pride and warfare. The council itself was divided on the matter, and no decisive action was taken. Arya, when pressed, said it was not her priority. If the people wished to raise a new seat, they could do so collectively. She would not stand in the way, nor would she champion it. Jon offered no opinion, feeling it was not his place. Sometimes he wondered if, in time, enough lords and small folk might come together to rebuild a new Winterfell, forging it from the ground up without the burdens of the past. Perhaps that was a dream for another generation. The seasons rolled on. The second winter since the castle's destruction approached, but the north was better prepared. Grain stores were larger, roads more secure, petty conflicts handled by the council's rotating leadership. Lord Umber came to rely on Glover for shipments of iron, Glover on Manderley for trade, Manderley on the lesser lords for timber, and so on. House Stark did not rule from a seat on high. Instead, Arya Stark served as an ever-moving presence, ensuring that no one house dominated. Jon Snow, once the king in the north, once the Targaryen heir, once the man who set Winterfell aflame, rode with her as an informal advisor and protector. They became folk heroes to some, cautionary figures to others. But the realm did not collapse, and that was enough. That second winter tested them once more. Heavy snows blanketed the roads, isolating keep from keep. The council scrambled to coordinate relief caravans, sending provisions to starving hamlets. Arya and Jon led daring expeditions through blizzards, distributing grain and salted meat. Once, they encountered a savage snowstorm that nearly claimed their lives. They took refuge in a ruined tower with a handful of refugees. For 3 days, they huddled around a single fire, listening to the howling wind outside. Ghost shared his warmth with terrified children, his massive body a shield against the cold. When the storm broke, Jon scouted the drifts for a path, and Arya helped guide the survivors to the nearest settlement. Every small success like that chipped away at the North's suspicion of Jon's motives. He was no lord, no king, but a man who braved the cold to save lives, and sometimes that was enough to change hearts. At last, when spring returned again, feeble but determined, the council convened in White Harbor for a grand gathering. This time, the city's streets were livelier. Northern and even some southern merchants filled the docks, hauling goods for trade. Tensions lingered, but the constant threat of war among the houses had receded. Arya and Jon arrived to find Wyman Manderley in ill health, his years and weight taking their toll, but still sharp of mind. He welcomed them with genuine warmth. "You two have done more for this land than any single lord," he said, voice trembling. "I hope you realize that." Arya looked uncomfortable, and Jon simply shook his head. "We just did what we had to do." The meeting lasted days, a flurry of debates and alliances. They discussed fortifying old roads, building new granaries, negotiating with southern houses for essential supplies, and forging ties with the free folk who had resettled areas beyond the wall. Arya pressed for a formal acceptance of them, ensuring that no future lord would exclude them from trade or brand them as savages. Jon gave input on how best to handle the harshest winter zones. In the end, the council ratified a host of measures to strengthen the North. There was no one leader, no resounding cheer of a new king in the North. Instead, there was agreement that each region's voice mattered. It was an evolution the old lords might never have believed possible. On the final day of the gathering, Arya walked the city walls with Jon at sunset. The sea breeze, tinged with salt, ruffled her dark hair. "This might actually work," she said, leaning on the battlement. "The North is changing. Slowly, painfully, but it's changing. And maybe—" She paused, eyes distant. Jon watched her, waiting. "Maybe what?" She turned, a hint of a smile on her lips. "Maybe one day I won't feel the need to roam every corner, ensuring no one's breaking the pact. Maybe I'll find a small place to rest, a home. If not Winterfell, then something else. Maybe I'll even plant a weirwood sapling, watch it grow." Jon felt a stirring of emotion. He thought about the boy he had once been, longing for acceptance in the shadows of the Starks. He thought about the man who had destroyed the seat of that family's power. And he thought about the realm that now, ironically, welcomed him as a wandering protector. "If you do that, Arya," he said gently, "I hope you find peace." She drew in a breath, voice turning hushed. "I hope the same for you, Jon." They lapsed into silence, each imagining the shape of a future unbound by the tragedies that had led them here. The gulls cried over the harbor. The setting sun gilded the waves with orange and gold. Perhaps they would never fully escape the memory of that fateful act, the burning of Winterfell that stained Jon's name in blood and ash. Yet in the 2 years since, they had saved countless lives, forged an unprecedented alliance among northern houses, and ensured that the North might stand without being beholden to any single seat. The legacy of House Stark lived on, not in lofty towers, but in a grit and unity that even war and fire could not extinguish. Night fell. Ghost padded up beside them, nudging Jon's hand for attention. Arya stroked his fur, and for a moment, they felt like children again. Siblings in a courtyard that no longer existed, guided by a father whose lessons remained. Then they turned from the battlements and walked back into the city, step by step, forging a future that honored the past without being chained to it. Thus the North carried on, battered by war, shaped by loss, but indomitable in spirit. If travelers ventured to the charred ruins of Winterfell's keep, they would find new growth winding over ancient stones, the hush of a place left to memory. And on moonlit nights, they might hear the distant howl of a dire wolf echoing across the emptiness, as if the ghosts of House Stark still watched over the land they loved. But those ghosts would find that the living had not forgotten them. Instead, they had woven the name Stark into a new tapestry, one that embraced survival, cooperation, and the unyielding heart of wolves. And in that quiet truth lay the final answer to Jon Snow's darkest act. The seat might be gone, but its legacy remained, carried on the shoulders of those who refused to let the North sink once more into petty feuds and ruin. Jon had razed Winterfell in a irate bid to free himself from destiny, only to discover that destiny was never contained in stones and mortar. It was carried by the people who remembered, by the blood and vows that bound them, and by the stubborn willingness to endure. In the end, that enduring spirit was stronger than any flame, forging a future beyond the ashes, and reminding all who beheld it that the North remembers, and, in remembering, it prevails.